year is going to be a very tough year for wage negotiations.
It's likely to be a winter of discontent in places like the Chamber of Mines in downtown Johannesburg. Here, unions representing 200,000 mine workers will negotiate for a new 2-year pay deal. This was the scene at the end of the talks 2 years ago, when the mine workers struck a deal between 9 and 10.5%. It took months and almost saw a strike. This time around, there are hopes that low inflation could mean lower wage increases for the many unions negotiating this winter. The Bureau for Economic Research survey for the first quarter shows analysts, business and unions predict inflation will average 5.3% this year. The survey also says wage increases could average 9%. Economists fear this growing gap between inflation and wage increases could stunt growth and hamper job creation. So here in Africa's largest economy, we're facing a winter of pay talks. How do you think the gap between wage demands and inflation will fare during these talks?
Look, I mean, we're hoping that this year that it'll be a more realistic gap in the past couple of years, because in the past couple of years we've had certainly very, very high wage expectations, despite the fact that the economy hasn't been doing terribly well. So ideally this year, what I'd like to see is that wage demands, or rather wage settlements, sort of equate to inflation plus a productivity factor, so that unit labor costs are not going up too strongly or are remaining fairly constant in real terms.
What difficulties do you think there are likely to be?
Well, I mean, there's an underlying problem in South Africa, and it's a legitimate one from the trade union point of view. There's a concern that obviously there's this wage gap between management and workers. So there's a big push from government side as well to try and actually narrow the gap, to try and actually make wealth and income distribution more equitable. But unfortunately, if you look at the economics of the situation, it would suggest the opposite. We've got unemployment at 25%, and we've got a skilled labor shortage. So, I mean, just looking at it coldly, you'd actually expect the gap to actually increase over the next few years, not actually decrease if it was left to economic forces. And if you try to close the gap artificially, I mean, the consequence would probably be that we won't see the sort of employment growth that government's hoping for.
Frans Beleni, the General Secretary of the National Union of Mine Workers, is going to lead this year's pay negotiations with mining companies. He says low inflation is unlikely to influence this year's wage demand expected at the end of April.
From what we are hearing from our members, that it is not relevant to their lifestyle, it's not relevant to what they are subjected to by the economy in general. And therefore, we must talk to what affect our members in real terms, not in terms of theory of analysis of average CPI. I've heard grumblings of our members that this year is do or die. So I suspect that if things don't go their way, they will give us a mandate to activate the laws, the provisions of the law in terms of a strike.
So there is a good chance that wage settlements in Africa's biggest economy could be a lot higher than expected this winter. Chamber of Mines says it's not going to comment until it receives demands from the unions. But it's clear when this country's biggest mining companies sit down to negotiate with the unions in June, we'll get a clear indication where the gap between wage demands and inflation is going.